This is a story of how art, science, democracy, republic failed a people, and how central authoritarian military control not only saved them, but propelled them into an interstellar powerhouse. Hi, Misha here, and today we're going to talk about the Cardassian Union. And to begin, we have early Cardassian designs here, at least from a Federation perspective. A station, 2 warships, and 2 cargo ships, freighters, transports. And we actually do see a number of different Cardassian freighters because, well, it wasn't really about military conquest. It was more about seeking out resources to legitimately supply the people, not necessarily in luxury, but to prevent starvation and famine. Things that had afflicted Cardassia Prime for generations, even centuries. It's an interesting story, and a bit of a unique one. So, let's dive in, going all the way back to the 6th century BCE AD, according to the Earth calendar. Back at a time before the military, when Cardassia was very artistic, scientific, and was ruled by democracy, the people, free speech, and how it failed them. For a time, things were good in the Cardassian homeland. There were different republics and states, and for centuries it all went well. But by around the 15th, 16th century Earth calendar, there were few food shortages and population was growing out of control. Resources were running short. It was soon discovered that Cardassia wasn't exactly blessed with lots of raw material. And by the 19th century, the governments that were there failed, and anarchy was really threatening to encompass the globe. But in stepped the military, forming the first Cardassian Union. This would be a centralized, authoritarian world government. They made promises if people would give up their autonomy, they would provide food, shelter, and a higher quality of life. And they delivered. So they quickly established themselves on the home world. But as I said, resources were very scarce. So their initial early space flights around Earth 20th century, early 21st, were into the Cardassian home system to get whatever resources they could. Of course, they're still a military, still an authoritarian system. Everything was geared towards the state. The state was without flaw, was perfect, was all-knowing, all for the state. Generationally speaking, by the 22nd century, Cardassian military, the Cardassian Union, had interstellar travel, FTL, and was making contact with alien races and establishing colonies. Things were going well. So much so that by the 23rd century, the Union dissolved and a Cardassian Republic formed. These were considered dark days, even a dark age. Thankfully, by Cardassian standards, it would not last long, and the Cardassian Union would be reestablished after the Republic failed. And again, expansionism would take hold to provide resources for the ever-growing population. And that gets us to kind of the Cardassian architecture. When it comes to buildings, space stations, other structures, 3 is a repeating theme for Cardassia. The re-established Union had 3 branches of government. There was a civilian council, the Datapa Council, which was intended to provide oversight and authority over the Central Military Command, although in reality it served as an advisory body and not much more. And the 3rd branch was the Obsidian Order, nominally the militia, the police. In reality, it was a secret society, espionage, something well suited to Cardassian norms and morals of the time. Their architecture might be considered a bit brutalist. Cardassians as a species like warmer temperatures and darker environments, less light. That's just what they were evolved for. And that is portrayed in their architecture. Darker grays, muted colors to some extent, with dark interiors, as it were. And of course, known under Starfleet control as Deep Space Nine, this was a Nora-type station when the Cardassians built it in orbit of Bajor. And that takes us to the year 2319, again according to the Starfleet Federation year dating system, the time when the Cardassians made first contact by visiting the Bajor system and the Bajor homeworld, which at the time Cardassian technology was estimated to be about a century ahead of Bajoran. Even though Bajoran society was technically older, they had focused on arts and literature, whereas quite sensibly the Cardassians had focused on more useful things like spaceships and weapons. For a brief time, relations were okay. But Cardassians would get more and more pushy, and then finally in the year 2328, Bajor was outright occupied. And that was to strip mine the planet for resources that were taken back to Cardassia and its colonies to supply its people. And this is where we really meet them and get into their history, because about the same time Starfleet, the Federation, was exploring and expanding into this region of space, previously not really explored during the 23rd century, but now with peace with the Klingons and the Romulans in kind of a timeout, the Federation had time for more science and exploration. Unfortunately, the Federation also wasn't really doing much to prepare for war or combat. Anyway, let's talk about Cardassian vessels and the nearly 2 decades long border wars with Starfleet, and of course the occupation of Bajor. Beginning in 2346, construction began in orbit of Bajor of Turek Nor, and primary assembly was complete by the year 2351 with gracious assistance from Bajoran totally voluntary workers that were most definitely paid. This was a large station, between 14 and 1500 meters wide, required a minimum crew of 300 with a standard of 2,000, and could house 7,000 to 9,000, including passengers and guests. And it had multiple purposes. In the center of the station, are the 6 fusion reactor cores, command center, and the commerce area, the promenade. This was meant to kind of be a command post for the overseeing of Bajor, administrative position. The inner ring was the habitat ring for permanent crew and guests. And the outer ring was for docking, cargo bays, storage. It also housed thrusters and defensive armament. Multiple types were seen on board, including sliding beam emitters, fixed beam emitters, and even some on turret-style mounts, as well as torpedo tubes. We have multiple types of docking ports, from heavy to medium to small, as well as landing pads, and of course shield generators. Even though this was an administrative and commerce center, its primary function was as an ore processing facility. When fully functional, it processed 20,000 tons of iridium ore per day. They would be brought up and docked to the pylons. A lot of the processing equipment were actually in the pylons themselves, and then processed ore could be stored in the outer ring for transport ships to come and dock to take it. That was its main function. Process the raw materials from Bajor in a safe place away from terrorists, and then Cardassian transports and freighters would either take it back to the home system or to friendly trading partners. And that's why the first couple of vessels to look at are not warships, because really the whole purpose of the Cardassian Union was to supply the people from, frankly, a region of space that was not that well endowed. The first design is a very common hull pattern with a considerable amount of internal volume. Although it's capable of relatively low warp, has relatively weak shielding and defenses. It's about 250 meters long, but it's a sturdy, dependable hull, easy to maintain, and you could fit a lot on board. Doesn't really have a name though. And these were to have regular cargo runs from Bajor to Cardassian and back. And it does have the telltale head that we'll see on other Cardassian vessels. This was in no way a combat ship. In fact, most likely it was a civilian merchantman, not even directly owned or operated by the military. And the Bajorans would operate some of these later, as well as other races. But yeah, very common hull design. Our next freighter or transport is a military design. Sometimes called the Grumal class or type. It's slightly longer at about 260 meters, but as you see, more narrow. On the other hand, it's more modular with external pod storage. Up to 30 squares could be locked on, meaning it was easy to detach and attach them. So more of an external design than internalized. It has the forked bow there, and the command center bridge is actually located in the back, kind of overseeing the cargo pods. This is capable of higher warp, and it has better disruptors or phasers. Still not great though. but it does have relatively strong shielding because it is expected to maybe transport more vital resources or through more hostile environments or longer range. This is an older design in service for decades, but it's sturdy and effective, easy to maintain, just reliable, solid vessel. It has more combat capabilities than the previous freighter, but not by much. On the other hand, it is very clearly a military vessel ran by a military crew under military discipline. So these two would make up the main merchant cargo freight fleet of the Cardassian Union, providing Cardassia Prime with much needed, desperately needed resources. But of course, the Union would have to be defended from alien interlopers. So we come to the true warships. Quite possibly the most recognizable Cardassian combat vessel of all time is the Galor class. Sometimes referred to as a warship, especially by the Bajorans. Combat cruiser seems to be most appropriate, at least during its heyday. And the earliest prototypes, which themselves were inspired by older Cardassian ship designs, layouts. Anyway, the earliest prototypes were flying by 2320. That would be the Type 1. Not coincidentally, just a few years before the invasion of Bajor and the occupation. Of course, it would take a number of years to put these into production. The primary facility would be the Monac shipyards, although there would be other subcontractors and other shipyards. Keep in mind, though, as we'll say throughout this video, limited resources. So it's quite possible it took them roughly a decade to go into service with the Type 1. And it's interesting to really observe these because we look at Starfleet, Human Federation, we look at Vulcan, Romulan, Klingon. These races are all close together, trade, and have been interacting and swapping technology for centuries. Cardassia is further out. They have their own design lineage and ideas and technologies. For example, this is a very long and narrow ship. It's about 481 meters. It has at least a dozen decks. We have a command center in the front. The wings, as they look here, are actually their version of warp nacelles. In the back, where the prong is located, we have a secondary shield generator. We have impulse drives and defensive weaponry. This was capable, at least later variants, of reaching warp 8, at least sustained speed, and routinely had a crew of 600, plus could transport soldiers. Its weaponry originally was quite unique. Spiral wave disruptor cannons, with at least one larger, heavier disruptor cannon system, and it used a variant of a plasma torpedo, although as contact would occur more and more with Starfleet, the Klingons, and others, some systems like phasers and even photon torpedoes would begin to appear. The design was meant to be economical, so modular and upgradable, solid, rugged, dependable. And it really showed. They were able to improve these over time and keep them in service for a number of years. Think of it as the Cardassian Excelsior class, in service for decades, but it was refit and updated. By the 2350s, the Type 2 was in service, and the Type 3 was in service by the 2360s. Looking head-on, we see a very narrow profile, which was good for defense, making itself a smaller target. It also was considered quite powerful with a good power core and very speedy, maneuverable, agile. It's sublight. But it wasn't all roses. For example, the sensors, the targeting systems were not as advanced as the Federation's or Romulans. The transporter system, while useful enough, was a generation or two behind, similar to what we see the Federation using around 2260. And internally, they're very military. Not exactly cramped, but not exactly with a lot of amenities. The shielding system was quite good, and the armament was effective enough with multiple installations. We see lots of configurations over time. And this really was the primary warship for the Cardassians. And that leads us in to really the first meetings with the Federation. And they did not go swimmingly. Setlik III was considered a massacre by the Federation or an intrusion on Cardassian sovereign borders by the Union. Either way, it sparked 2 decades of on and off border wars. And they were hard fought. Now you might think, well, the Federation, Starfleet, is much larger, more advanced than the Cardassian Union. This is very true. But Starfleet had a lot of territory to monitor, a lot of planets to defend. And for decades, it really wasn't focused on military gains, more on science. And its fleet, while effective, was aging. In the 2340s, we see mostly Mirandas, Excelsiors, although we do have some newer classes like the Ambassador, but they're fewer and further between. So really, the Type 2 Galors went up against the Miranda and really could hold their own. We would also see them later doing well against medium Klingon ships like the Kevort-class Bird of Prey. And while Cardassia had fewer ships and, a smaller military, they also had smaller borders and could devote more resources to scrabbling with the Federation. So it was a little case of the Federation being lackadaisical and the Cardassians being able to throw all in. And by this point, they've occupied Bajor for a generation. They're producing more and more refined ore, and so they're able to fund their military. And this actually would kind of end up being a feather in the Cardassians' cap. While they didn't defeat the Federation, they signed a treaty which actually gave them some territory, some gains, and the fact that they were able to go toe-to-toe with a major Alpha Quadrant power and not be defeated, hold their own at the very least, really promoted them to, at the very least, a regional power. And some in Cardassia sought to become a superpower, one of the big three, along with the Romulans and the Klingons. And with the occupation of Bajor and other planets, the functioning of several Nor-type stations, and the latest version of the Galor cruisers, they were kind of placed for it. And that would lead to the next generation of Cardassian warships. In 2364, the first test flights of a greatly improved and expanded Galor would occur, and this would result in the Keldon class put into full production by 2370. And that's what we have here. And yes, it does very much resemble the Galor, because that was really the base. But it was expanded upon externally and internally. And a more capable design for sure. The Keldon was about 491 meters long, had 15 decks or more. It had a large module on the top for expanded mission abilities. It had a crew of 700 plus ability to carry soldiers, improved power to the shields, uprated warp system capable of cruising at warp 9, and even getting up to warp 9.6 for a short time. The impulse engines were also given more power, more thrust, and it had extra energy left over to support additional systems to make it more multi-role. This was classed by the Cardassians as a heavy combat cruiser. Some might consider it a battle cruiser or just a warship. These would never be built in the same numbers as the Galor because they were more expensive. Interestingly, not only did the military operate the Keldon, but the Obsidian Order operated a fleet of these as well. So this is one of the most advanced Cardassian cruiser designs, at least before the war. And it was originally designed to go toe-to-toe with the next generation of Federation ships, namely the Nebula class, or in groups, maybe even the Galaxy. Typically, Cardassian ships, when facing the Federation, would try to operate in groups of 3. Again, kind of going back to their preference for 3, but also just to make up for the ships being on their own weaker. So yeah, 3 of these could definitely challenge a Galaxy. Maybe even 3 Galors. We're not really sure. But these are larger vessels. They also see a need for a smaller ship. Taking inspiration from small but effective, powerful destroyers like the Bird of Prey, or the Federation's later Saber or even Defiant classes, Cardassia introduced in the very late 2360s into the early 2370s the Hideki class. This was first introduced as a patrol ship, a border defense ship. It was about 98 meters long, so not the tiniest in the world, but not large. It could operate with a crew as few as 5, but a standard crew was roughly 30, although it could carry more soldiers. We also see these used as a VIP armed shuttle type transport, and we'll see them operated as destroyers and escorts as well. They were equipped with at least 2 main disruptor banks, possibly others. They were able to cruise at least warp 8, possibly faster, and had reasonably strong shielding, and were pretty much an effective little ship. You can see the little bridge here. It's recessed for better defense. Just as the Galor was a multi-purpose, adaptable ship cruiser, this was kind of the small equivalent. These are still considered quite new, well before the beginning of the war. So things were looking up for Cardassia, but, well, 2369, the Tapa Council would prevail after increasing terrorist strikes and years of lower and lower output from Bajor. The occupation was ended, although secretly the Cardassians hoped to come back someday. They hoped to just be gone for a while. This was a blow to their prestige. Also, finally signing a treaty with the Federation, which was ratified in 2369. This would result in the Maquis, which would needle the Cardassians. And this, too, would be kind of a strike against their pride and resources. Also, all of the military expenses of the 2360s would come due. The bill would come due in the early 2370s. And so there would be political winds of change. And their aspirations of being a superpower started to ebb. And then there would be conflict with the Klingons starting off in the year 2372. And this would not go well for Cardassia. In fact, the Klingons would take over quite a bit of territory and threaten Cardassia Prime and the home system itself, which would lead to more of a defensive mindset and a further reduction in resources and the ability just to, bring in resources to the home systems. Therefore, work on this began. The Remote Defense Platform. One of the most advanced pieces of kit that the Cardassian military would ever create. This was not manned. It was not only remotely operated and automated, it actually had a power source that was remotely stored to provide redundancy. It had 3 heavy disruptor banks. It had hundreds of plasma torpedoes. Some could carry as many as 1,000. And it had a regenerative multiphasic shielding. It was a tough nut to crack. These would be put in orbit of Cardassia Prime and other important installations, shipyards, or could be hidden in asteroid belts to surprise potential attackers. Now, development had been underway for years, although these were not deployed en masse until the Dominion War had already kicked off. But it is a uniquely Cardassian design. You can kind of see the 3 coming out in just the general shape, not dissimilar to the Norse star base. But it does also kind of show changing priorities. This is them getting more defensive, but also getting smarter, but not abandoning their love of rugged dependability and redundancy. So they made headway. The military government, first the Obsidian Order, was crushed when they were goaded towards an attack on the Founders' homeworld, which wiped out the majority of their fleet, along with the Tal Shiars. Next, the military would see their power erode because of the Klingon activity. This would leave the Tatapa Council, the civilian government, kind of back in charge. And things never really go great for Cardassia when the civilians are in charge. With Klingon aggression and continuing threats, this would lead to the somewhat unexpected alliance with the Dominion. And of course, that would bring Jem'Hadar ships into the fleet with the Cardassians. Cardassian architecture and shipbuilding might seem different because of them being further out in the Alpha Quadrant, but the Dominion, well, being in the Gamma Quadrant, is an entirely different design track. Interestingly, most of their designs are very old, decades or even centuries, because they've had dominion over their space. With the Jem'Hadar being custom bred and addicted to the white for control and all of that, their love of central authority, in the silky words of the Vorta, the fit with Cardassia made sense at first. After all, the Maquis and the Klingons had embarrassed them. Resources weren't good, the Bajorans were being obstinate, and Starfleet was an omnipresent threat. The Dominion promised that the Cardassians could become the superpower in the Alpha Quadrant under, of course, the benevolent guidance of the Founders and the Vorta. So, even though the Tatapa Council wasn't really privy to this, Gul Dukat, former prefect of Bajor, eventually legate, would make the deal, and so 350 Dominion ships would cross the galaxy via the wormhole, establish a beachhead at Cardassia Prime, immediately destroy the Maquis as kind of a early birthday gift, and push back the Klingons to the pre-war territories and then some. And eventually this would lead to the occupation of, again, Terok Nor. This was the primary ship of the Jem'Hadar, quite versatile, but definitely a warship. Either used as an attack ship or a patrol ship, sometimes even like a heavy fighter. It was about the size of a bird of prey, about 120 meters long. Had a standard crew of 42. Most were all Jem'Hadar plus one Horta, although they could sometimes have passengers or cargo. If Cardassian ships seemed austere inside, they had nothing on Jem'Hadar. They were bred just like the soldiers. The ships were bred and made for war. They were capable of reaching warp 9.6 or greater and cruising at least warp 9. They had ability to detect through cloak, at least close in, with tachyon beams. So, yeah, they didn't do so good. Their primary weapon was a polaron beam. They also had disruptor banks as a secondary weapon. And they had a type of Kerma-made torpedo, analogous to a plasma or a photon, but different. They had very good shielding, very good sensors, so making up for the Cardassians. This was tried and true technology, and for the most part was more advanced than what Starfleet had. In fact, originally their weapons could punch straight through Starfleet's shields, but this would be addressed. An all-around very good solid ship. They could land on a planet and take off. They operated in large groups, and they could be easily snapped together like Legos at a factory. So soldiers that could be bred quickly, and ships that could be bred quickly. And in this era, the 2370s, we're seeing more and more small, potent ships. The 2360s were the era of the large ships. Now we're at the era of the smaller ships. And that was kind of the deal. The war would kick off by 2374 and quickly heat up. And when a little ship just wouldn't do, the Jem'Hadar, the Vorta, I would say the founders, but they could give two shits about day-to-day warfare, they would call upon the battlecruiser. Yeah, they really didn't give their ships exorbitant names. It's functional. This was considered to be basically as large as a Galaxy class. Actually, it was a little larger at 760 meters and at least twice as powerful. It had a large forward-facing polaron beam bank plus multiple smaller disruptor or polaron beams for defense, and it had a large multi-tube forward torpedo launcher, so it had a very good forward assault ability. This was meant to kind of crack the tough nuts, star bases, planetary defenses, or just, large fleet formation. So it had a very hefty punch, very strong shielding, and a few of these came over during the initial voyage through the wormhole. We actually see two slightly different variants in the wings, and of course more were built in Cardassian space, which is now officially part of the Dominion, so Dominion space in the Alpha Quadrant. So this was more or less the backbone of their fleet, but seen in smaller numbers, because usually the little ships, they could just throw them in waves, even doing suicide runs if needed, as the USS Odyssey found out. But this would continue. But the Dominion wasn't just warships, although you might think so and could be forgiven for that. Once a population, a people, were thoroughly subjugated and demoralized, the Dominion would back off. They would try diplomacy at first, and then they would try increasing levels of discipline until people figured out their place. But afterwards, trade could happen, of course with Dominion approval. And that gets us to the Kerema. This is the Kerema freighter. About 380 meters long. It's a pretty large freighter with quite a large cargo capacity. It's a pretty advanced ship, all things considered. It's quite automated. It only requires a crew of about 24 officers and men. These are the same guys that built torpedoes for the Dominion. So one might assume that the ship at least was allowed one torpedo tube for defense, plus disruptors. It did have decent shielding. But yeah, this is the primary trade ship, commerce ship of the Dominion. And we see these in the Gamma Quadrant. We later see some in the Alpha Quadrant as well. It even seems like the Bajorans captured some. The Bajorans were in a sticky spot during the war. They were nominally neutral. They had a non-aggression pact with the Dominion, with Cardassia. But that gets into politics. This is definitely part of the fleet. But things will start to change. Up to then, the reoccupation of Terra Nor, Gul was in charge, and the Cardassians were treated with respect. They were in the honeymoon phase. But after the Cardassian Dominion Alliance lost the station, the Federation took it back, and Gul went crazy. And Damar, his second in command all the way back from the Grimal days, became legate in his place and decided he really liked drinking a lot of Kanar. The Cardassians were no longer in high esteem of the Dominion. That's not to say they ever really were, but at least they said nice words to them. But after they failed them, well, some other projects would kick off. In fact, they started dating someone else. In 2375, much to everyone's surprise, including Legate Damar, the Breen were announced as a new Dominion ally. And this is their primary ship, the Gortan class cruiser. Already at this point, the Cardassians were being used more and more as cannon fodder. And they were bearing the brunt of the war, even being punished. And now the Breen are the new darlings. They have a new fancy energy dampening weapon, which was used effectively at the Second Battle of Chintaka, and it caused the loss of over 300 Federation, Klingon, and even Romulan ships. So quite a major defeat for them, for the Alliance, thanks to the Breen. Their cruiser here is partially organic. It has 3 heavy forward-facing torpedo bays, plus energy beam weapons. It's not all that large, about 330 meters, and it's very flat. On the other hand, it's very quick, agile, and maneuverable, and we don't know more than that, although they do even have a strike on Earth, just as a point of fact type thing. The Cardassians were not fond of the Breen, few were, but the Breen had been raiding Cardassian vessels for at least a decade, even capturing some Cardassians and enslaving them. The Breen were from even further out in the Alpha Quadrant, and were just a big mystery, a big unknown. And the Dominion started promising the Breen assets that originally had been granted to the Cardassians. And this is already kind of showing where things are going to go, and I'm sure after the Breen, they would have been put in their place in another Alpha Quadrant race put on a pedestal until they were equally subjugated. And just to drive that point even further home, the Dominion, the Jem'Hadar, had one more ship. The oh-so-creatively named battleship. And this is one of the few starships around in the 24th century that would perhaps make the Romulan Decks look small. It was considered to be twice as large as the Galaxy class and 3 times as powerful, but that's a bit of an underestimation. It was about 1,500 meters long, very many decks, and had a standard crew of 2,500 on board, although it could carry many more than that. It had 10 heavy torpedo installations, at least 2, probably more, heavy polaron beams, multiple smaller polaron and disruptor beam installations, secondary and primary shielding. It was essentially a mobile command base and even growing hatching facility for Jem'Hadar and training them. And it could be used by a founder as their command post too. Yeah. Now, the trade-off was it was a little slower, around warp 8. And of course, even for the Dominion, it was a little resource intensive to mass produce. So, there were only a handful in the Alpha Quadrant, perhaps as few as 1. And typically, these would be kept around orbit of Cardassia or other places where they really need to show the flag. But not much known about this, except it is the largest ship and arguably the most powerful ship of the entire Dominion War. And it was there, yes, to attack the Federation, the Allies, but also, yes, to remind the Cardassians who was boss. And that's why by the end of 2375, this was routinely kept in orbit around Cardassia Prime. By this point, Cardassia is really not even thinking about becoming an Alpha Quadrant superpower. Heck, even their status as regional power is under threat because they're not their own masters. Not so different from how they occupied Bajor. Now they're occupied by the Dominion. Plus now the Breen. And they invited them in. Things only get worse when their vessels are classified as assault vessels or attack vessels and used in waves as cannon fodder. The Hideki classes, the Keldon, the Galor, losses mount, and things come to a head when, as a reprisal, the founder orders the elimination of an entire Cardassian city. This forces what would have been brewing as an underground rebellion into outright revolt. At the same time as the Alliance is pushing for Cardassia Prime, the Cardassian ships turn on the Dominion ships and the Breen. So now the Dominion is fighting a war on 2 fronts. Everyone's shooting at everyone. The Cardassians never sought to slaughter the Alpha Quadrant. They felt they were superior, and they wanted the rest of the galaxy to acknowledge it. In truth, it was an inferiority complex because they were the new kids on the block compared to the Starfleet Klingon Romulan group. And they had technology catch-up to do. But they didn't want this, so in the end, they do turn, and at a heavy cost of millions, even billions of civilian lives, the war is brought to an end. That said, Cardassia is laid to waste. Interestingly, the Treaty of Bajor doesn't strip them of all their territories. In fact, for the most part, they return to pre-war standards, although a few colonies and things were lost. and rebuilding will be decades in the coming. And the Dominion, for their part, they're not defeated. This was just an expeditionary force in the Alpha Quadrant. Their Gamma Quadrant is completely untouched and unchallenged. And again, their soldiers are literally expendable, even the Vorta. The only ones they care about losing are the Founders. And thus, the war ends by the end of 2375. But of course, the story doesn't end there. Although for the most part, the Breen kind of skulk back to whatever world they came from. An ice world? A desert world? A perfectly temperate world? No one knows. They're kind of assholes, honestly. Under the leadership of Garrick and others, and in Damar's memory, Cardassia slowly, painfully rebuilds, with much help from the Federation. They actually even sent a small assistance fleet to help the Romulans when their star went supernova in 2386. In the 2390s, they would again emerge, building some of their older ships, including an updated version of the Hideki class. And then they would introduce this, the heavy cruiser or dreadnought, the Damar class, named after the war hero. This is a much larger ship than they have made to this date, at roughly 800 meters long, and it still has the same kind of general Cardassian layout, but it's a much smarter ship, still using spiral wave disruptors, torpedo banks, all that. It actually has sensor drones. That was one thing Cardassian ships were kind of behind in, where their sensor technologies assessing the enemy or even just unknown ships. So sensor drones became a standard. This could also deploy defensive platforms, like we've looked at. It could even carry a small wing of Hideki patrol ships or attack fighters. And it had a crew of roughly 1,000. And it also had some stealth capabilities. It was able to mask its warp signature. It was capable of high warp of at least 9.7. And was designed as a command and control ship. And while it had abilities for defense and offense and all that, they made sure to not make it look like an outright warship or call it as such because of the political climate. And these were by necessity built in relatively small numbers because they needed freighters and transports much more than they needed defensive ships. But they needed something because they still had borders and conflicts were still occurring as the 25th century rolled around. But in a lot of ways, yeah, it's a traditional Cardassian design, just very updated. So this was their new flagship that would eventually replace more the Keldon than the Galor, but really both as time moves on. So what about the Dominion, the Jem'Hadar? As I said earlier, they had been using the same designs for decades, maybe even centuries. The attack fighter patrol ship and the battle cruiser. Really unknown if the battleship was new or just something they dusted off when they needed it. But as the 25th century rolled around, a new type of Dominion ship is seen. This is the creatively named carrier. And this is even larger than the battleship, at nearly 3,000 meters. So it's about as long as a board cube is wide, but a cube's also 3,000 meters tall and long and wide all at once. Most of this one's length is front to back, but she's got some girth in her too. This was designed to be a mobile base for a founder. Typically, there would be at least a founder on board to control it. With thousands of crew, it had weapons, of course, but its main idea, this was a launch facility and a repair refurbishment facility for smaller ships. It could carry at least 6 to 8 smaller Jem'Hadar craft. It had 2 shuttle bays, including the large one on the dorsal side, with a bit of a strip for landing and takeoff. And just had research facilities and everything else is needed, science abilities. To date, it's the largest Dominion Jem'Hadar vessel we've come across. Of course, it would have multiple Vortas on board, and hundreds of Jem'Hadar crew, plus thousands of soldiers, cloning facilities, presumably Ketracel White facilities. It would be very heavily defended. A loss of one of these would be quite dramatic, even for the Dominion. While they don't mind losing Jem'Hadar, even Vorta, losing one of their own, a founder, is something that matters to them. So yeah, the carrier. And it supports the smaller ships, as you would imagine. They continue to use the attack fighter. And so that's where the Dominion ends up as the 25th century rolls around. And that's current date, as of everything in Star Trek. And with that said, we end the portion of the video where I talk in-universe. Now, this is real world. My thoughts, observations, and behind-the-scenes things, and just my general assessment of these cool little die-cast models from Eaglemoss. Although today being distributed by Master Replicas. Did this for fun. So far, I've had a lot of fun doing it. But yeah, let's just chit-chat about Cardassian, Dominion, and the others. And the rest. The Cardassians first appear in The Wounded Season 4 of TNG, a very good episode, and a Breen episode, and really the first time we get a good look at the Nebula class. No joke, even though the internet likes to make one today, when I first heard about the show Keeping Up with the Cardassians, I had no idea who the Cardassians were, and I thought it was some weird Star Trek thing I'd never heard of. That really went through my mind. And then when I found out what the Cardassians were, I immediately didn't care. Because not getting into the judginess of vapid, superficial culture, those kind of shows don't teach anything. So, bored, moving on. And you could probably tell kind of from the beginning they were hoping the Cardassians would become something, because they actually got their own ship. In the days of actual studio models, if it was a minor race, you would just get a straight up reuse. And if it was a medium race, you might take a tried and true studio model and modify it. But no, the Cardassians were one of the blessed few that got their own design, and a very different one too. It wasn't just like generic alien ship number 8. It's their own thing, even with their own color job. But you can definitely tell it was beginning as a studio model, because it's not simple, but CGI ships have a lot more going on, bits and pieces sticking out. Studio models actually had to be supported. And I did know what a Cardassian ship looked like before the Eaglemoss. I saw a model when I was a kid, also the Micro Machines, I believe. But I do like it. It's their own thing. The one from Eaglemoss is fine. It's a little lighter than you think. It's got more plastic than maybe I'd like. This is metal. Wings are metal. And then this is plastic. But it is long. I mean, it's fine. I like it. You have to have it for the fleet. But one I was really excited about, and actually I got mine in early on my birthday, so that just made it kind of even neater, was the Keldon. Now, I didn't know exactly what this looked like before the Eagle Moss, but of course I knew it was a modified Galor. It's got this big pod on the back, these fins. Now, you would think Eagle Moss would just take the same mold and add to it, but actually one thing they were always good about was a whole new mold for a model. We see this a lot with the Nebula and Miranda variants. This is not the same base mold as the Galor. It's, of course, a similar difference, but the profiling is a little different. So they made a whole new thing for this. It's actually heavier, too. There's more metal. This pod's still plastic, but no, I really like it. Now this is more of a something to put together because they needed it for that episode with Thomas Riker, something a little different. We don't see these many times, but they wanted something they could just take the standard Galor model and tack some stuff on and then remove it afterwards. So yeah, that's the real world reason why it looks this. Same kind of reason for the Excelsior refit for the Enterprise B. I wish we had seen them more though. In the CGI era, it is easier. But I was really happy Eagle Moss did this one because it's often overlooked in the fleets. Moving on to the freighters. Technically, this one is listed as a Bajoran freighter. In Star Trek, this is kind of a generic model that's been used for lots of alien ship, including Cardassian. Even if we see Bajorans flying these, we can argue that they got them from Cardassians. It's just a freighter. But the front definitely reminds me of a Cardassian a bit. And there's some compact nacelles on the sides. And the central body is very Star Destroyer-esque. At least I think so. It's very much a background ship, and one that most makers wouldn't do, and one I'm super glad Eagle Moss did. They were great at doing these kind of just workaday background ships, and this is actually very big. It's one of the bigger Eagle Moss models, and it's a good weight too. The top is metal, part of the bottom plastic, but no, it's got some good heft to it. We see this in other things like the smuggler ship. And it was a practical model. But I've said it many times, that's what Eagle Moss was good at doing, was just all these ships. Because most of your model makers will do the Galor. But yeah, who's going to do a freighter? And if they would, it would be the Gamal over here, because that was Goldacot's ship, and it was rather prominently seen for an episode. Fun fact, this is really the only Cardassian ship we get any time inside and get interior sets. Sure, we see the backgrounds and bits and bobs of bridges, but we actually see various places on this ship. Since Goldacot's such a fan favorite, yeah, you gotta do his ship. I'm surprised they didn't do his bird of prey. Maybe it's like a con special. I guess there just wouldn't be any markings differences, but still. This is a little on the small side. It's long, but because it is relatively tall and everything, it just kind of, fitting the box. It's kind of odd how they did it. These pods are metal, but the other side are actually plastic. That's just how the mold works. And the top ones are metal in the bottom. So, yeah, the starboard side is plastic, but the port and the top and the bottom pods are metal. The fins, yeah, they're plastic. It's got a decent weight for what it is. We see this design a couple of times in DS9. It's, specially made for the show. Uniquely Cardassian. but also very uniquely a freighter. But it's a whole new design. And that's pretty cool. We had to wait a while in the fleet to get it, but we did. And then the Hideki class. We originally see this in more of a gray color scheme as a patrol ship. And then later in the Dominion War, we see it in this color is more of an attack fighter. Again, very much analogous to like the Saber or the Defiant. We even see kind of a Defiant style bridge here. And it appears a few other times being used as a transport shuttle just because they need a small Cardassian ship. It's very much Cardassian. You know, these wings are definitely the nacelle sections. Presumably these landed on planets, no problem. Very flat. It's a good size though from Eagle Moss. It's palm sized and it's mostly metal. The whole top is. Only a little bit of the bottom part of the wings plastic, but no, they did a really good job. I can't really complain. It's nice that they gave the Cardassians kind of a secondary ship. Doesn't need to be all Galors all the time. They were kind of bad about always falling back on the Klingon bird of prey. I need to blue tack that in. This is a little loose. Maybe it's just because I like the look of the Vorcha. I feel like they always get short shrifted. But no, the Hideki is a welcome thing both within the Eagle Moss fleet and Cardassian here. And then we get to the Star Trek Online. First off, I want to say this really clips into the stand good. It's kind of got a prong thing back here and it clamps in. I know this will shock you. I don't play Star Trek Online. Can't imagine why. But it's a Cardassian ship and it's neat. And I like to add to the fleet. I like that they kept the basic Cardassian lines, but they also didn't stick too close to convention. This is its own design for sure. And I like how they named it after Damar. Yeah, he was a flawed person and even a bit of a collaborator, but the truth is most historical heroes were just humans. They had good and bad days. They've made some good decisions and some bad. But history needs heroes and leaders and inspirations. And so that's what Damar became for Cardassia. It's a neat ship. It's a good size too. The online ships always struck me as a little bit bigger overall. And this is no different. It is really a good scale. And very few other companies would do a physical model of a ship for an online multiplayer game. But I don't have much to say about it because, yeah, it's from a game. And before we move on to the Dominion, the Orbital Defense Platform, this was a bonus edition. And I don't get all that excited about stations, but I'm really actually glad I grabbed this one. It is heavy. This is all metal. The only plastic is the top. And I think even that's mostly metal. Aside from some small detail points, this is a heavy thing. It's kind of funny how such a side thing they would put so much effort into. But it did play an important part in an episode. Now, I don't really want to talk about Deep Space Nine. This was one of the early special editions. In fact, it might have been one. That's all metal. The pylons are plastic, but everything else is metal. It's a good size for what it is. They did do an XL version, but I never bothered to get it. This was big enough for what it is. And of course, I knew what DS9 looked like, again, from models and the toys and whatnot from back in the day. But, you know, I grabbed it on sale because you almost have to have it. It's a great background piece. And it is definitely Cardassian. So that's the Cardi fleet. Or as Miles O'Brien would have called them, the Spoonheads. But that's a derogatory term, so you're not supposed to use it there, I guess. What about the Dominion? Now, these are designs I really had no idea what they look like. Friends never had models, and we were still practical for the original fighter, sometimes called the Bug. Kind of get why. It's kind of got a tarantula looking belly here. These wings. Very insectoid. But also identifiable starship parts. Even though it looks insectoid, it doesn't look to be organic. It definitely looks purely mechanical. I like it. They did a good job. It's a good size. It's lighter than you might think, even though this is all metal. But this and this, the wing parts are plastic, so the butt is plastic, but the front end and nacelles are metal. But for its size, you'd think it'd be a little heavier. It's not exactly light, but yeah. Now this is the primary Jem'Hadar ship. There's actually debate about its size, anywhere from 100 to 150 meters. Kind of just depends which show. I don't know that they even really outlined it in the Bible. It pops into its stand quite good. There's kind of a little notch. And it stays just fine. I like it, but I was actually very excited to get the Jem'Hadar cruiser here. And much larger ship. Again, this is the metal. This is the plastic. The big pod underneath is the plastic. Weight-wise, it's about the same. Kind of funny that it's such a larger ship. But again, these aren't made to scale because that would never work in Star Trek. The ships range from a few meters to a couple of kilometers, just depending on what, so you never could do it. But no, this is a good size. These never got a lot of attention in DS9. They were just background big ships. I mean, that's okay, but we see a lot more of the little ship inside, including that one they steal and rework. These are just flying around doing their thing. There was a CGI of this and the studio. There was a kind of a sub-variant or whatever. One of the models had more of a V-shaped wing. One of them had more of a U-shape. I don't think they meant for two variants to exist. It's just, you know, when you do production. Look at the different models for the Defiant. Both CGI and physical. There are changes. But there was a practical model of this too. Just one of those background ships. That's glad they did. That way it just wasn't all the little bug fighters, but it does kind of keep the insectoid, you know, the pincer thing, the prehensile looking thing. I don't know. Again, very much mechanical, but like a mechanical bug. Next up, the battleship. And yes, a lot of people do mix up the battleship and battlecruiser. One thing I'm going to say, I've never had it fall off the stand on the shelf, but it is very wiggly because of the way it connects in the back. So if you knock it to the side, it'll come right off. I would advise us a little bit of blue tack. This is actually a little heavier. It's more metal. With the plastic being bottom piece here a bit. This is such a large-scale ship in the show, and they make such a big point out of it being massive. I've said this in other videos, but I really wish they had done this as a special. I mean, given the constraints of this scale, they did a good job. But it would look a lot more impressive as a special. But they mostly reserved specials, at least back then, for things in films or, you know, major things. Nowadays, that's kind of the normal size. You see it with the Discovery lineup and the Universe. But back then, when they were doing the Starships collection, yeah. Unfortunately, they just didn't determine this. In the end, I was just happy we got it, because it came out pretty well towards the end of the line. But this is a starring thing in the episode The Valiant. And then it pops in a time or two, especially in the final episode, just kind of orbiting. It doesn't really do much, it just hangs out and is big and threatening. But yeah, this is the big badass ship. Now, you think this might have been used as kind of a MacGuffin or doomsday weapon, but no, after the Valiant, it doesn't really get mentioned much again, which is, I guess, good. They could have made a big deal about, oh, they've got this one ship, blah, blah, blah. But this seems like it was a roving command station of a sort. And our final one here is definitively that. R.I.P. Odo. Yeah, this was the command carrier, sometimes called the Vanguard carrier, that he used in Star Trek Online. And this is just huge. I do like the big dorsal bay. You know what this really reminds me of? Really? Wing Commander. Think about it. The TCS Tiger's Claw. Don't you think? Or maybe the Concordia. But it reminds me, especially if you took the nacelles off, of something from that universe. So Chris Roberts. Either way, yeah, big ship. I'm a sucker for carriers. I love aircraft carriers, so a spacecraft carrier. And since we already established that the Jem'Hadar have little ships, you know, when the Federation has fighters, cannon fodder, that doesn't make sense. But for the Dominion to use the Jem'Hadar's cannon fodder, yeah, sure, why not? This is large, but light, actually. It's very thin. This is metal, plastic. Most of the weight's in the front, which is why on the stand, this sets for crap. I put a little blue tack in the grooves, and you see it right there. You just kind of plug it in there and squish it in. Nice thing about blue tack is it doesn't really leave residue. And then it sits just fine. Every few months I'll replace the spots, but you really have to, otherwise that one's going to fall off. They get increasingly more precarious with the Jem'Hadar ships for some reason. As for the Karma freighter, you know how I feel about freighters now. I was happy to get one. This was in a few episodes, including that one with Quark and the undetonated torpedo. We see the model reused over Bajor as part of Kira's blockade against the Romulans in Season 7. No explanations really given. They probably just reused the ship. But we can just say that the Bajorans captured one. Why not? Or maybe it was given to them. This is actually a larger model than you'd expect. Metal. Plastic. I like it. Doesn't have a particularly distinct design. That's okay. My only thing is, on the underside, there are these hollows. Here and here. I don't think those are supposed to be there. I mean, I know all the models have them. I don't mean with mine. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the CGI model had spots there. Let me know what you think. It could just be an oversight. We've seen Eagle Moss, not often, but occasionally make that error. The Negavar and Klingons. But the nice thing is they are on the underside. They're even kind of hidden with these fins. Well, you know, there's a gap there. I guess maybe they are supposed to be there. Because there's a hole there. I don't know. Well, let me know what you think. I'm happy to have it. Again, background ships are cool. This one came quite late in the collection. And anytime we get more ships from a major alien race, I get tickled. And finally, our Breen friends. This came out pretty early in the collection. And definitely, this has all the hallmarks of being a CGI model. And you'd think this would be light and plastic. Believe it or not, it's mostly metal. Even the sticky yaddy bits. It's flat, but for its size, pretty heavy. That's plastic there. But yeah, it's nicer than you'd think, and a weird design. I had no idea what a Breen ship looks like, and I've had this for years, and frankly, I still have no idea. It's different. Now, this definitely has that biomechanoid, bioorganic machine thing going on, but that's cool. I like the Breen. They were neat, and it's nice that they just weren't brought in for season 7 out of nowhere, because we had heard them referred to multiple times, and of course there was that episode where Dukat goes and rescues the owl. What was that, back in season 4? 3? Early on. So that's one thing that was nice about DS9. They had plenty of new alien races, but when reusing an already established race would do, they did it. And I liked it. And they got better about that as the show went on. Seasons 1 and 2, they were about as flippant about making a new race as TNG or Voyager. But then they realized, hey, we're at a fixed point, a station, and it's more fun to build upon the lure. So let's do that. And that's kind of where the Cardassians and Dominion both benefited. So what do you think? Let's wrap it up. Fun fact on the Breen ship. I had it on the stand wrong for a long time and never could figure out why it was so loose, but there's actually, if you push it over, there's a little notch and then it plugs in actually very tight. Anyway, I like it when things stay on the stand well, but not so tight that you risk breaking something. No, the Cardassians were really fleshed out well, beginning with 4 seasons in TNG. In fact, they were in some of the best episodes of TNG. And then, of course, Deep Space Nine, they're the whole thing. It's not just that Gul Dukat was quite possibly the best villain of all time in Star Trek, which he probably was. I mean, certainly gave Khan a run for his money. But the whole race was. And you had sympathetic Cardassians, and you had assholes, and you had people like Damar that were kind of bad, kind of good, just people. Quite a few of those. Very three-dimensional as far as, TV writing went. The Dominion, they were more nuanced. They weren't cruel for the same part. They just didn't value solid life one way or the other. They'd just as soon keep someone alive as kill them, or kill them as keep them alive. It didn't really matter to them. And of course the same thing went for Jem'Hadar and Vorta. They did seem to have some affinity for some of the Vorta, like Wayun, in a way that we would for our pets. At least our pets that we could clone. So, yeah. But they, too, have become some of the most popular villains. And, of course, the Changelings, at least a variant of them, recently reappeared in Picard. I guess spoilers, but fuck it. Season 3. And there was even a near name drop for Odo, which was nice. And of course we've seen Cardassians, or at least a half Cardassian, in Discovery seasons 3 and 4, and presumably 5. So they're still around. In fact, there was a changeling in season 3 or 4, whatever it was, of Discovery. No, I really like them. I'm happy that as time goes on, DS9 has gotten a lot more acclaim. It was kind of the, I don't say black sheep, but it was the lesser of the Star Treks for a lot of people in the 90s. But keep in mind, it was the first real spin-off. I mean, TNG was kind of felt to be the successor to TOS. Same basic thing, Enterprise crew going places. This was them trying something new. By the way, yes, I really like Babylon 5. In fact, I was just talking about that tonight with my wife. That's a discussion for another day. Who ripped off who, and they're on the so forth. Can't we just say that both were excellent shows? Although, for both, season 1 was a little rocky, but both got increasingly good in season 2, and by season 3 were on fire. And I really enjoy getting his little ships from Eaglemoss. It's a shame that Eaglemoss is out of business. Who knows if Master Replicas will ever do more Star Trek. But, you know, we had over 200 of the small ships and, you know, good grief, 100 of the medium size, probably if you count the Discoveries and Universe and all that. So, can't complain that we didn't get our time out of it. In fact, they made pretty much every ship I can think of. There were very few exceptions. Even the handful that existed they had in production, like the Scorpion fighter. The only one we didn't get, this is going back to Romulan, they were going to do the concept Warbird, the vertical one. That would have been neat to get. But it was never on screen, so yeah. But yeah, I just felt like revisiting the Cardassians now that we have the whole fleet. I added the Star Trek Onlines. I've had these for a couple of years. I just haven't had time to really talk about them. Everything else you've seen before, but hey, needed to get them off and dust them, so seemed like a good time for a video. So what do you think? Where do you rank the Cardassians, and the Dominion for that matter, in the whole Star Trek villain pantheon? I still like the Romulans more, but they're up there. They really are. And what ships do you like or don't you like? Let's discuss in the comments below. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.